This is an overview on how to use intake forms to import data into ProTempus. ProTempus allows its users to easily create intake forms for different types of cases, to populate documents with the data collected. There are two types of intake forms. The first is a contact intake form, that allows you to create one or more contact records and capture data about each contact. This type is useful for adding a corporation with multiple shareholders to your contacts. Another example would be adding a new client and their family members for the creation of a will. The second type intake form is case-specific, which will collect the data needed for a specific case such as dissolution. Case-specific intakes require that you have already created the client's contact record in ProTempus and need to collect data for a specific type case. To help understand the two types, I recommend you pause this video and print the two sample intake forms that were included in your ProTempus update. To print these, click on the Contacts button on your toolbar, type LIB, then select your forms library. Then click on the Documents button. In the root of that folder you should see a file named intake.txt. Select that file and open it, then send it to your printer. Next, scroll down and look for a subfolder DOCUNK. You will see a second intake.txt file. Select and open that file and print it to your printer. You will notice there are also files named intake.test.txt. These files were also added as part of the ProTempus update. They contain test data so you can test importing intake files on your system. You can also print the test files, which will let you see the completed intake forms. Now pause the video while you print these intake forms. You can open these intake forms on your library and modify them as needed. As you look at each of these intake forms, you will see the top contains instructions for the party completing the form. You can modify these instructions to meet your specific needs. The instructions can be formatted as needed. Keep in mind, text files do not support variable fonts, bolding, etc. We decided to make intake files text files for two main reasons. First, it makes it very easy to create and maintain. Text files can be edited on any type computer using any type word processing or text editing program. If you want your client to complete the intake form, you can email it to them and they can complete it on any computer. The second biggest advantages of text files is that you can send and receive text files to and from clients without fear of transmitting or receiving a computer virus. It is impossible for a virus to hide within a text file. The most common transmission of viruses today is via Word documents and PDF files. If you send an intake file to a client to be edited, you should request that they keep it in a text format. Some word processors will try to convert it to their native format, unless you specifically save it as a text.txt format. Following the instruction section of the intake, you will see a line that begins with a square bracket. This is the first data field of the intake form. Each data field starts with a square bracket in the first column. The field name is contained within the square brackets. You can add subfields after the field names. For example, after a name I have added 3 subfields: last, first, middle. These indicate the format the user should use in providing their name, entering their last name first, followed by a comma, then their first name, a comma, then their middle name. ProTempus will use these subfields to parse the responses correctly. After any subfields you can add additional instructions within parentheses. These can be instructions to the user and are ignored by ProTempus. You must fit each data name, subfields and optional instructions on one line. The blank line after each data field is reserved for the user to enter their response. If a given item required multiple responses, the user will enter each on a separate line. For example, if the client has multiple bank accounts, they can enter each on a separate line. To create new intake forms, you can start with these two samples and create your custom intake forms, adding them to your forms library. Click on the Contacts button on your toolbar. Type LIB, select the Document Forms library from the short list. Click on Documents and you will again see the sample intake.txt file in the root of the folder. You can create alternate intakes by clicking on Create Document and modifying this sample. If you want to create an intake to create new contacts, you must add it to the root of the Forms library folder. Click on Create New Document. Select intake.txt or an alternate text file from your forms. Name the new document to match the type of intake. For example, I may name it Intake Simple Will TXT, to create an intake for collecting the data needed for a simple will. Now modify the intake form to add the questions needed for the type case. Intake forms that are stored in the root of the Forms folder are contact intake forms. Anytime a data field ends with the word name, ProTempus will create a new contact record with that name, and import any data that follows under that contact's record. Intake forms added to subfolders of the Forms library are case-specific and name fields, are added as memos to the case and will not create new contact records. This distinction addresses two different needs, and must be kept in mind when you design your intake forms. If you want the intake form to create new contact records, you will create it as a contact intake. Case-specific intakes require you create all contacts associated with the case prior to executing the intake form. I do not recommend your clients return completed intake forms via email if it contains personal information. Email is not a secure way to send confidential information. Returning the data on a new unused thumb drive is the safest way to receive data from your clients. Now let's demonstrate importing data using intake forms. First, I will import a new client named James Bond with his wife's information to create a simple will. Open the intake.txt file from your forms library by clicking on Contacts, typing in LIB, and selecting the Forms library. Click on and open the intake.txt. On our system, text files are opened in Notepad. When using an intake form to create new contacts, you must first save the intake file to the ProTempus folder on your C drive. I will use the Save As feature in Notepad and select the ProTempus folder on our C drive. I must save the file with the file name intake.txt. Once I have saved it, I can close Notepad. Let's quickly review this intake form. It is designed as an intake form for a simple will. You can see that first I have collected the client's name and address, phone numbers, date and place of birth, date and place of marriage, which is data I need to complete the simple will. Notice I'm also capturing the client's gender. This is required so that ProTempus can correctly select gender-based adjectives. After the client's information, there are 3 data fields, which will set up the case. First, I define the type of case with the name of will, followed by the billing type of FR for flat rate and the billing rate of $500. The billing type could have been HR for hourly or CT for contingency case. Next, in the intake form, I have collected the spouse's information, followed by the names of 2 executors. To import this intake to create new contacts, I will click on the Contacts button on the toolbar. I then click on the Cases Parties button. ProTempus will see the intake.txt file on its folder, and will ask us if we are ready to import this file. I can also choose to edit the file if I need to make changes prior to importing. If I select yes, ProTempus will import the intake file. Once complete, I can click on Contacts and type Bond. I can see James and his wife Sally have been added as contacts. This data is now available to create any documents requiring the information from the intake form. If I select James, I will see the address and phone numbers for the intake form have populated his new contact record. If I click on the Activity/Payments button, I will see the additional information has been collected as memos to file. Each data item is listed separately with the response collected from the intake form. If I find there was an error on the intake form, I can easily click on the item in the activity list, and make the needed correction. Now I am ready to create a simple will. From James' contact record I will click on Documents. I want to create a new document, so I will click on the Create New Document button. You should see a form document that was installed by the ProTempus update, named Will from Intake. Select this form. Notice ProTempus uses the form name to name the new document I am creating. I can change that name, if needed, prior to creating the new document. When I click on Continue, ProTempus will use the data from the intake form to populate the data fields in the form, and display the document using the ProTempus embedded word processor. The document assembly functions are an integrated part of the ProTempus word processor. You will notice the ProTempus has highlighted a field halfway through the document, which contains 3 symbols. The document requires the date of the signing of the will. I probably would not have known that date at the time that I imported the intake form, therefore I could not make it part of the intake form. ProTempus has a special feature. You can add 3 symbols to a form, which create tab stops, and when you load that document, ProTempus will automatically stop at the first tab stop. Here I need to enter the day of the month that the will is to be signed. I will enter the 25th. I then hold down on the Control key, and press the Tab key, and ProTempus will advance to the next tab stop, allowing us to enter the name of the month. This form has 2 more tab stops that require real-time data. Using the simple will as an example, I have shown you how to create a contact intake form needed to complete a simple will. Next I will demonstrate how to import a case-specific intake form. Let's assume a year later James Bond returns to our office and wants to file for a divorce. I will create a new case under his contact. To do this, pull up James' contact and click on Cases Parties. You will notice the will I created last year is now a closed case. Click on Create New Case. Click on the down arrow after the billing code. I will select a predefined billing code for domestic, uncontested with no kids. After creating the new case, I will create a new document under his document folder by clicking on the Documents button and then clicking on Create New Document. I will select the intake test.txt file from the forms library under the correct matter. This will open the predefined intake form in Notepad. I can then email it to James to be completed, or have a staff person conduct a phone interview to collect the data. In this example I have already collected the data needed to complete the Missouri Department of Health Certificate of Dissolution. This document requires a large amount of data and is a good example to show how intake forms can streamline document creation. Once James' data has been added to the intake form, it must be saved under the correct subfolder using the name intake.txt. This intake form requires that the parties are already added to ProTempus, and we need to define the role of each party. From James' contact record I will click on Cases Parties. I will select the domestic case and click on Parties. James has 3 roles in this case. First, he is the client, next he is the petitioner, and he is also the husband. ProTempus added him as the client when we created the case. I will now add his role as the husband by entering HUS in the role field and selecting James from the contacts, and then we also add him as the petitioner. A given contact can have multiple roles in a given case. We have abbreviated husband, petitioner and responded to make it easier to use the fields in the document form, since we have limited space. Next I will add Sally as the wife and respondent. By defining the role of each party in the case, we can create a document form that works in all scenarios. For example, Sally could have been our client, and by changing her role from respondent to petitioner, our forms document still works. I have one final step prior to importing the intake. I must save the completed intake form to the client's document folder under the correct subfolder. Now I am ready to execute the intake form from James' contact record. I will click on New Event. From the activities list I will select the activity, Import Intake Form. This will instruct ProTempus to retrieve the intake.txt file from James' document folder. ProTempus will import the data from the intake form. Once completed, you will see the activity for James now contains the data from the intake form. If we look at the memo for date of birth, we will see the data is represented in month, day and year format. We can also see it is also split up into the subfields. This feature ensures maximum flexibility when using the data for various documents. Some documents may need the entire date of birth. Other documents may just require just the birth year or only the month and year. By capturing the data in this fashion, I can handle both scenarios by just entering the data once, instead entering it multiple times, to handle each different document requirement. Once the data has been imported, we are ready to create the Missouri Department of Health document. I will click on the Document button on James' contact record. Then I click on Create New Document, and select the form from the Forms library. ProTempus will populate the document and displays the newly created document. We can see that it advances to a tab stop at the field asking how the husband's prior marriage ended. Since this was James' first marriage, this question does not apply. When ProTempus encounters a field that is missing from the intake form or is left blank, it will automatically generate a tab stop with that field name. This allows the author to focus on potential problems areas of the document. We can resolve this question by deleting the tab stop. We then press Ctrl-Tab to move to the next tab stop until the form is completed. We are now ready to print the completed document. This concludes the training on creating intake forms. Next, I recommend you view the video on creating form documents that use data from intake forms.